Hey, good morning everyone. We're going to start off the second track with Sutherland, who is a software developer by day but a kind of security researcher by night. He's going to be talking about some of the weird platforms you might find in your office, including some office hardware and just what exactly you can do with some weird pieces of equipment. So I'll hand it over to Graham.
Hello. I'll try and speak up because apparently we've got no microphones in here. Unfortunately, I've been ill for the last couple of weeks, so a bit of a sore throat. I'll try and keep going. So, who am I? Graham Sutherland. Some of you might follow me on Twitter, G Sutherland on Twitter. As he said before, software developer by day, security researcher by night. Try to get as much security stuff done as I can. My day job. Nothing to do with security, unfortunately. Ended up working for a company that does ERP software for the textile industry, which isn't exactly the most thrilling environment to be in. I've got an extreme addiction to IT security Stack Exchange site. I'm sure you all know about Stack Overflow. Don't know how many you know. There's a lot of other sub-sites, everything from sort of parenting to cycling. There's also ones for crypto and IT security, hence the t-shirt. And that's my my sort of description of myself on the site. I'm sure you can all read that one. Right. A couple of disclaimers before I start. First one, speak for myself. My company that I work for doesn't really do anything about security. Whenever I talk about it, they kind of do this sort of glazed look and are you like some illegal guy or something? You know, it's a bit weird. So yeah, I don't speak for anybody but myself. I might be wearing a Stack Exchange t-shirt, but I don't represent them in any way. I'm just a big fan of the site. And yeah, if you don't like bad language, what are you doing in Scotland? And no cats were fed to photocopiers during the making of this presentation. Please don't sue me, Peter. So, what's the deal? Your typical office has a lot of electronic hardware in it. Most of the time, you would probably look at a printer or a photocopier and go, so what? I'm going to generally look at the three different classes of stuff that you would see in an office. The really obvious stuff that you would have on your network. You've got your desktops, your laptops, your smartphones, your routers and your switches, all your typical sort of core network hardware. Then you've got your kind of more obvious stuff that's around. You've got your printers, your photocopiers, your UPS, so your uninterruptible power supplies, projectors, like the one we've got up here. And the not so obvious stuff, your aircon, your lighting control, privacy glass, your interactive voice response stuff. That's the stuff you get when you phone up your bank and it says press 1 to blah blah blah, press 2 to blah blah blah, press 3 to hold for an hour. Fire alarms and your general sort of industrial control stuff and your SCADAs, and I won't get those two mixed up because if I do, Mercurial from Twitter will come out and punch me in the face because he hates that stuff. Most of these devices from the second two sets aren't designed with security in mind at all. At most you'll find that security is an afterthought. Some of them have some pretty shocking holes in them. And we're going to have a look at how we can have some fun with some of these. So, maybe the obvious stuff from the obvious category, as I put it. Doesn't have to be so obvious. So there's plenty of attacks that can be done on desktops, laptops, smartphones, tablets, routers, switches, etc. that everybody already knows about. You know, there's hundreds of presentations, there's hundreds of papers that you see out and about on the internet. Everybody's seeing these. I'm not saying that they're not cool. You can do some really nice sort of buffer overflows and this, that, and the other, but why not do something a little bit more unusual with these devices? So, for example, what can we do with old wireless routers that we bought from eBay? You know, you can pick these up for nothing. What might be hidden in them? So, the WGR 614 router is something I've been playing with. You may well recognise it. It's very well known. I happen to bring two with me. So, bog standard router. A lot of ISPs ship these. In fact, it's one of the most common routers in the UK. Netgear produced quite a few million of them over the last 10 years, and NTL, now Virgin Media, used it as their router of choice for a very long time. I have about 12 of those in the office at work that I can see from where I'm sat. There's a lot of them out there. Thankfully, they're kind of locked down a little bit at work. So yeah, there's a lot of them are out there. They're based on the Atheros chipset, which is like a system on chip that manages wireless, generally the 802.11 wireless stuff. And the settings are stored in it's an EEPROM chip, which uses an SPI bus, which is a serial peripheral interface bus. It's basically a way that electronic devices can talk to each other with on a board. I won't get too much into that. It's not particularly important. It's just a way that a processor can talk to a particular chip on a board. Another one's I2C is another major one. It's just a simple bus format that allows it to just talk. And there's various other routers in the same family that are very similar. For example, the WGR624, pretty much all of the WGR6 series are pretty much the same hardware. They just jiggle them about a bit on the board and put a different front end on it and say, look, here's a new router, but pay me more money. It's crazy. So that's what it looks like inside, or like this if you want. They're damn easy to take apart. This one is actually quite... The one I've got here is a WGR614 V7, and that's a V9. And the difference in terms of internals, it looks quite a bit different, but all they've really done is moved a few chips around. So if you end up buying one of these, just take a look after the presentation. You may find that it doesn't look like that at all, but it is actually the same thing. It's quite easy to isolate this particular chip, which is, if you actually care, it's an MX25L1605 SPI EEPROM. It's basically just a flash. It's the same flash memory that you would get in a USB stick, 16 megabit. So essentially, all that really happens is we've got the Atheros chipset here. Writes the settings and it has a bunch of bootloader firmware stored in the EEPROM, and that's where all the actual code is stored, apart from the SoC stuff that sits on the chip itself. It's got an internal system on chip stuff. But there is like a bootloader in there and then a bunch of setting configuration stuff. And it's just a chip. It's nothing more than a chip. You can quite easily dig around and desolder it. So this is a bus pirate here, this bit of kit. I actually won this for catching a Nerf missile at 44Con, so thanks to the 44Con guys for giving me that. That was a lot of fun. I've got the EEPROM chip desoldered. Very easy to do if you've got steady hands. Unfortunately, I suck at desoldering, so I got somebody else to do it for me. Stuck it on a little breadboard, hooked up a bunch of pins to it, hooks it up to the bus pirate, and the bus pirate is essentially a way of talking to electronic devices directly via a sort of command line interface that's run over a serial port. So you can use PuTTY to talk to it, you can use a variety of interfaces to talk to it. It's a way of sending human readable commands to a particular chip. Now these chips, you can get the data sheets for them online. There's a whole bunch of really complicated looking electronic stuff in them. If you know nothing about electronics, it will be daunting when you look at it, but in fact you can just skip past all of it, and what you'll find is some quite familiar tables with a bunch of hexadecimal in them, and all that really says is, okay, send these commands in this format over the SPI interface to it, and it will do this. You know, you can write a bunch of data, read a bunch of data, get the unique ID for the chip, all sorts of configuration information about sort of write protection and things like that. If you're just trying to read data off it, you can do it quite easily. As I said, desoldered it, soldered it onto a breakout board, hooked up the bus pirate, and I wrote a little bit of code. Took me like less than half an hour to write the code. All it literally does is open up the serial port, tell the bus pirate to configure it as an SPI device with a bunch of certain parameters, and then send a bunch of data to it, and then read everything that comes back, which basically says, give me as much data as I like until I tell you to stop, and it just gives you all the data. So you can actually read the entire contents of the EEPROM back out onto your computer, which just dumps it into a binary file. Now, we inspect the loot, because we pull all of that data off into this binary file, and there's some interesting things in this EEPROM. Now, keep in mind, I'm guessing probably at least a few of you have one of these in your house, or have had one of these in your house, if you've ever been with Virgin Media or another major broadband provider. Hardcoded super user credentials. Oh dear. That was the first thing I spotted. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it included the word God, so clearly the movie Hackers was correct. All sysops love to use God as their password. Lots of copies of the same config file, so the config file for the router, so you, all of the information about what settings you've currently got running, you go onto the web panel, you change your settings, and for some reason the config file is copied over and over and over again. The web control panel and Wi-Fi passwords are all plain text. Not so much of a vulnerability because you need physical access to the device, you need to desolder the chip, blah, 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 blah. Not that big a deal. Kinda. What are the hard-coded credentials for? So the first thing I thought was, oh, hard-coded credentials, that's going to be really fun. So let's go dig into that and find out what I've broken. And why the fork do we have 10+ copies of the same configuration file? That threw me a lot initially. Took me quite a while to work out what was going on. So what have we here? The hard-coded credentials turned out to be quite boring. If you want to directly flash the device with a new set of firmware, you have to actually solder a bunch of pins onto the board and then hook up a special cable that goes into a serial port, and then that actually connects you up to some sort of weird Telnet server that runs internally, and you need that username and password to get into it. So it actually turned out to be quite boring, but I submitted it anyway as a bug, well, not a bug, but as a disclosure, so that people know it exists. So it's got a CVE ID, there it is. The multiple copies of the config look like they have slightly different settings, and it looks like old copies. So I decided at that point, kind of a good idea to dig into how this particular device stores its content. So let's have a look at how the file system works. So the WGR614 file system is actually quite boring. There's a short header. There's a pointer to the next offset in memory on the chip where the next file should go, which is where the next block of free space is. There's a file list that contains a list of all the individual files. There's only like 3 files on these devices. There's no need for them to have any more than that. So you need file 1, 2, 3, and then your next file pointer tells you where the next free block of space is. Now, a config update goes through a short process, but it's quite an odd way of doing things. First, it generates the new config file in memory. That's bog standard. Then it increments the next file pointer. So it says basically this is where the next bit of file data is going to go. This is where I'm going to put the next entry in the file table. The file table is like a fixed size, so you cannot actually have more than I think it's about 256 files on the device. Never going to need that many anyway. Famous last words. It adds a new file header entry. Writes the file data onto the EEPROM at the next file pointer to say, this is where the data needs to go. Marks the new config file as current. So we've written a new config file onto the EEPROM, and then we've marked that file as this is the current one that you should use. And finally, it deletes the old config file header entry from the file table at the start. Now, why is it really done like this? Well, the annoying thing about flash chips is they wear out. They've got a limited write cycle on them. You can only write them so many times. So this is a kind of a clever way of, one, not having to deal with the idea of making files get smaller or larger. It allows for a smaller code footprint, especially on SoC devices when you've got very, very limited code space. And it also helps in the sense that you end up actually wear leveling. So I'm assuming most of you have heard of wear leveling on flash devices. Essentially, because if you continually write to one particular sector on your flash chip, what happens is it wears out. Wear leveling distributes those writes evenly across the chip and keeps a map of where stuff is stored. It's like the inverse of defragmentation. You purposefully fragment your files because there's zero read overhead because you can jump to wherever you want, and it saves you from burning out particular blocks of your flash chip. And considering these are consumer devices, they probably want them to run for a while and not sort of flake out and die. So, quick survey. You all own routers. How many of you, just by raising your hands, just your router dies, you throw it in the bin? Yep. Most of you there. All right. How many have ever used the same password for your router as something else? And I'll freely admit to accidentally doing that a couple of times. Yeah. And how many of you have thrown away a device or got rid of an old router that was broken, you didn't want it anymore, you got a new router, and so you don't have to update your devices, you use the same password again for your Wi-Fi? Yeah, most of you, I thought you might. So this is going to be interesting for you. Deleted does not mean erased. You delete files on a computer, it generally soft deletes them, it doesn't write over the sectors. Well, guess what? The same thing happens on flash chips. So deleting it is just like the soft deletion. Old file data remains on the EEPROM. Now you remember I was talking about these weird second copies of the file. On a 16 megabit EEPROM we can get roughly 10 copies of the old config file before it loops back round from the end of the chip and says, oh, I haven't got any space here, and goes back and writes over the old data. The old unused data, but it was never wiped in the first place. And all the old passwords are kept in plain text for both the web panel and your Wi-Fi. Not good. And some DHCP client information is kept too. Unfortunately, the copies that I got, the DHCP information, it had like IP addresses and MAC addresses, and it was tying them together. But it was kind of hard to figure out what was going off, and it looked like some of the data had been corrupted. I'm not quite sure what was going off there. It was a bit weird. But and guess what? Factory reset won't help you because it only overwrites the first 2.5 megabits of the EEPROM with new data. So if you've got all these copies on it, it doesn't help. So what actually happens is it completely just drops the at the very start of the EEPROM. You've got that firmware block. The SoC drops it from the ROM into that EEPROM, and that's been reported as that CVE number. The manufacturers of the routers do not give a toss because, frankly, they're not going to recall their biggest line, and trying to fix this issue for a large and very, very large scale section of their product line, which is probably every router in existence, probably. I would not be surprised if most routers you can do this on. And not only that, it doesn't just apply to routers. If you've got a device with a flash chip, this is happening probably. So the moral of the story, don't assume that a device won't have remnant data just because it doesn't have a hard disk in it. Flash memory is hard disks too, if you want to put it that way. You know, if you sell your old router on eBay, guess what? You just sold your old passwords to the guy as well. It's really not difficult to take these off. I don't really have that much knowledge around electronics, but it's really, really not that hard, especially if you've got a bus pirate, and they're cheap. You can pick them up for like $30. So yeah, you just threw all of your old network topology data and all your passwords. And I would imagine on some of the bigger sort of, you know, like the Cisco hardware that you would get that would have these kind of flash, the switches, all of that sort of corporate network hardware, that's still going to have the same problems. And sometimes the least interesting data on the thing that you've just discovered actually turns out to be the most useful. So when you're doing a pen test, if you do actually find some sort of random data on there, it may actually be that the cool stuff is actually really boring and the boring stuff is actually really quite cool. So don't just discount it, because that's what I did at the start and then realised, oh god, no, the stuff that I thought was really good is really mundane, and the stuff that just looked like random configuration data actually turned out to be something cool. And the mitigation for this, first one, don't actually throw away your old routers. It's kind of, if you're going to throw them away in a safe way. Like, for example, get a pair of 9-volt batteries and fry the EEPROM with them, because it's a 3.3 volt CMOS device. You will absolutely melt the internals of the device with 2 9-volt batteries, and that's good enough to kill off. That's more than good enough to kill off the memory of that one. You can always pry it off with a screwdriver and flush it down the bog. I have a funny feeling that most attackers aren't going to go sieving through shit to go and look for your... Bit of Shawshank Redemption for your EEPROM. No, I don't think that's going to work. Or you could go the long way, desolder the EEPROM, and erase it with the bus pirate, solder it back on, and then resell it. I don't see that happening. Unless it's really high value hardware, in which case it might actually be worth it. Or get your manufacturers to include secure deletion in their products. Good luck with that. The great thing about SSDs is that actually everything is encrypted on them anyway, and there's a master encryption key in there, and when you go to do a secure delete on a flash drive, all it really does is change that key, and all of the old data doesn't need to touch it, but because it's AES, you've just changed your key, and therefore it's all gone. But obviously on your other devices, no, that's still broken. Right, so what other devices can we look at? Let's go for something a little bit less tried and tested, an office photocopier. The Samsung printer bug, which some of you may have heard about, I'll very briefly go over that one. And a big UPS unit, so a massive uninterruptible power supply for an office. This one's quite fun. Right, the photocopier. Found this at a previous workplace. Unfortunately, I don't have the exact details because, one, I wasn't allowed to take the exact details, and two, this was quite a while ago. It's hooked up to the network. Of course it's hooked up to the network. It's a photocopier. Wait, no. Yeah, for some reason it's hooked up to the network. Apart from actually printing stuff on it, which nobody ever did, it was a photocopier. People only ever used it for photocopying. It's got lots of nice features like copy, print, double-sided copy, stretch, crop, and a web panel, and SNMP, and UPnP, and SMB, because, you know. Oh, and FTP, and NTP, and Telnet, and various custom stuff. The FTP thing was so that you could upload documents to it, and then it would print them, instead of, you know, just printing them. NTP, I have no idea why NTP was running on this thing. I don't know. Telnet was for some sort of weird remote configuration thing. I never quite worked out what that was for. Various custom things I just did not have time to dig into. DNS. It had a bind server on a photocopier. Yes, seriously, I don't know why that was there. It was just completely insane. And POP3. Apparently this actually ended up being some kind of bizarre method of doing email alerts for when paper was low.
It wasn't a Xerox, was it?
It was not a Xerox. No, for some reason it had POP3. Apparently this was some completely insane implementation of doing email alerting. I don't know why it was there. My jaw hit the floor when I looked at the Nmap results and I went, what? What is running on this? That's insane. Completely and utterly mental. Right, so let's look at the attack vectors, as if I actually need to tell you. The web panel was vulnerable to XSS and CSRF, no surprise. SNMP v3 not supported, so if anybody actually sends SNMP stuff to the private community section, so SNMP is like a network management thing, there's a public area and a private area, so you have these community strings. The public community string is nearly always public. The private one is usually something random. But before SNMP v3, there was no crypto. So if you could sniff the network, you could sniff anybody doing anything in SNMP, and you could just pull out the community string and, oh look, you've got full control over the device, because it's like UPnP at that point. You can just change all the settings without any passwords, because you've got an IP, because that's, you know, authentication. And again, UPnP allows for all the usual nasty stuff, altering routing tables, changing the device name, for example, changing the message that it says on the photocopier when it says ready. So you might want to change that to, you know, maybe feed me a cat. Which is, I don't know whether you've all seen American Psycho, but Feed Me a Stray Cat, that actually came, the picture I found there was of some guy had written a script that would actually just change it on pretty much every single photocopier and printer on the planet, and it would just work. because that's interoperability. That's what we really need. And yeah, you can turn off the NIC completely. Just one button. Oh wait, you've just DOSed the entire printer. And altering the actual internal configuration data. And a broken SMB server implementation, basic fuzzing, just literally it fell over straight away. So probably vulnerable to remote code execution. I didn't even try at that point. I was just face palming so hard I didn't even bother. Right, page 2. Too many holes to enumerate. It's just getting silly. All of the services were out of date by years. Who updates the services on their photocopier? It's a fully fledged Linux box as well. Yeah, that's where things get nice and fun, because there's remote code execution bugs in every single service, and some of those services are running as root, because, privileges are hard. Nice platform for your covert network operations, otherwise known as you got in, where do you hide? Hide in the photocopier, because nobody looks in the photocopier. Is the photocopier broken? I'm not quite sure, because it's always broken. And I ended up installing IP tables on it, just to lock it down a bit, for example, blocking the POP3 traffic, because there's no reason for anybody to need that. The only thing that I ended up leaving running on was the actual print server daemon and the something else, can't remember, couple of real sort of small standard things that we actually used, unlike NTP and POP3, which I'm still scratching my head. So don't trust your photocopier, ever. May have a lot of features and some pretty silly services running, because, stick all the features on every product, because it's a great idea. Web panels, always running HTTP. I've never seen one that's running HTTPS. I've seen so many printers and so many photocopiers, and I've never seen them use HTTPS. And if they are HTTPS, it's self-signed anyway, so you just get in between them and just SSL strip or whatever. Doesn't matter. Nobody ever updates the services. They're ridiculously easy to hack. They're a great base of operations because nobody ever looks at them. Often in trusted areas of the network as well, because, oh, it's in the office, it's trusted. Yeah. You can kind of use monitoring to watch for dodgy traffic on the way out. That's as a minimum, because if your photocopier is sending out stuff, that's when you start to worry. Where's my photocopier talking to a weird Russian site? What's going off here? So yeah, or stick a firewall in front of it if you can. If you can split it off into a separate area of your network, almost like a separate DMZ for just your weird office hardware, then do that if you can. The Samsung printer bug. This is quite well known now. Kind of stupid. SNMP is useful. But hard coding your SNMP private community strings is pretty dumb, because it means that if somebody reverse engineers it, they know your private string for every single person that has one of these devices, and it's even more stupid when it's the same for every device that you make. So every Samsung printer in existence before about last year had the same SNMP private string. You could get into every single one of them and just change all of it without needing to know the password. You could DOS it, you could do whatever. Some of these are, these massive ones that you see in big offices, some of them are little desktop ones. The bigger ones are better because obviously the bigger ones have the real computer inside them, which you can then use to hide and do nasty things. And they all run a common firmware type. It's pretty much, the only difference is like drivers and stuff that they run inside them. And all of them have a bug that actually stops you from turning SNMP off, which is super awesome, because it's dumb. But basically, you turn it off from the control panel, and what it really does is it turns the public part off, but not the vulnerable private part. Well, useful. And let's just sort of move on to the next part. UPSs, power to the people. So there was a big UPS unit in one of my old jobs. It was responsible for keeping the entire office running and a bunch of servers that we had in the back for. Essentially, in the event of a power failure, the company did sort of like a managed service thing. So keeping our local servers running was kind of important. Surely a UPS can't be hacked. Of course it can. It's completely crazy what people actually stick in these things these days. There's a web panel for diagnostics, SNMP for stats, and SNMP traps for alerts. SNMP traps are basically just these broadcasts that say, oh my god, something's gone wrong, or oh, everything's all right. You know, it's basically an alert to say something is happening, or something has happened. So for example, an SNMP trap for the power's gone out, the battery level is 100%, we're all good, we're carrying on. The battery level is now critical, you're about to lose power, which is really useful to get an SNMP trap when your power's just gone out. But yeah, you know, it's yeah, these things are plugged into the network, and often you probably wouldn't even go, you would just go, oh, a UPS, not, oh, a UPS in my network, eh? And there's some really scary stuff in this one actually. The internals of a UPS unit, I'm just going to go very briefly into this because it kind of gets a little bit important for the next section of it. UPS unit contains 4 major parts. You've got an input power supply, which is your AC from the mains, gets converted into DC for charging the battery and for ancillary circuitry inside the device. There's your battery, which is just basically a big chemical energy storage. It's just a big battery. Don't need to explain what a battery is. Output power supply turns the DC to AC. It's what's known as an inverter. It's basically an oscillator and a big power transistor, and it goes, okay, here's a sine wave, and then you output an AC signal at however many volts you want. And then there's a control unit which manages all of that. So for example, it runs the web panel, this, that, and the other. Yeah, so the control unit detects when the input power supply failure occurs to say the power's gone out. It monitors the total battery level, checks output noise, current spikes, runs the web panel, sets up your SNMP traps. It's basically a glorified. It's a little embedded system. Sometimes embedded Linux, sometimes just a microcontroller with a bunch of native code running on it. SNMP v3 not supported again, so sniffing possible, trivial to extract the private community string. Often they are set as default anyway, so if you can find the default SNMP private community string, you can play with stuff. Private namespace contains some interesting configuration settings. Reference voltages, oh, that's really nice to be able to change. Current limits, noise tolerances. So a reference voltage is essentially, the way the inverter works inside a UPS is you have a set voltage to say this is the voltage that we want the peak of the sine wave to go at, and there's a programmable power supply inside there. It's just a chip, and it basically says, okay, I will generate this voltage, and I will have this current limit, and if it goes above this current, I will cut everything off and say, oh no, it's all broken. And the reference voltages for a standard 230 volt output is actually 320 volts because 230 volts is what's known as the RMS voltage, which is the root mean squared average. So it's not actually at the peaks that you get that voltage, it's what's known as the RMS voltage, which is slightly lower. So if you actually take a voltmeter to a, don't just plug it in, but to a power socket, and you look for the peak voltage, it'll actually be about 320 volts and minus 320 volts at each peak, rather than, sorry, peak to peak will be 320 volts difference, whereas the actual RMS voltage is about 240. So when you actually look at a UPS's SNMP private settings and find out that 320 is one of the values, and it says VREF, you kind of go, that's kind of scary. Didn't try it, but you can actually change the VREF, apparently. And if you change it, that could be catastrophic because you could probably set it up to like 500 or something and melt the power supply, or you could blow up all your server hardware. That'd be really fun. It could be really catastrophic. And there's no fix available because there's no patch for bad design. That is literally, you stop putting SNMP in these things and giving them access to changing your voltage levels in your it's just not. I don't know why I'm even having to say this, but it's insane. So engineers don't really think about this sort of thing. They're going, oh, I need a way to test what the voltage is whilst it's, you know, whilst I'm on a client site, SNMP seems like a good idea. Oh, private string, nobody will ever look at that. Oh, yeah, they will. So yeah, you can probably melt a lot of things with certain UPSs, big ones. And to put it bluntly, we frequently plug chemical explosives into our networks because you know what happens when you short out a laptop battery, it goes bang. imagine what happens when you screw around with the UPS's internal voltage generators. That's going to be one hell of a bang. And then we attach critical network infrastructure to them. Good going. And your photocopier is the equivalent of a 6-year-old unpatched Linux box with an ink cartridge attached to it. Do you still trust it? Because I don't. And if you don't still trust it, why are you still plugging it into your network? Because it's convenient, and who's going to break into it? Until somebody breaks into it, and then you're kind of screwed.
Have there ever been any situations where this has actually happened?
Not aware of it. I'm happily not aware of it. Though there was a similar thing that happened at, it was a major university, it may have been MIT, but I can't remember off the top of my head. Where a gas pressurization bit of kit that they had in one of the labs was broken into, and it blew a gas cylinder through 4 floors and out the ceiling. Yeah, don't screw around with your ICS gear.
We did it with the printer at our university, because one of the configs you can do is actually turn off the heater to dry the ink faster. But that's just a flip, so you can just turn on the heater and wait until your printer catches fire.
Oh, lovely.
It's a feature, not a bug.
Well, there you go. And as I said right at the start, security is almost always an afterthought on these devices. The first thing they think is, what can I do to make my job easier if I have to go onto the site and fix one of these things? The second one is, what does the customer want? And the third thing is, oh, what's that security thing that I had to do? I can't remember. Let's stick something in there, and it's always crap. Right, I'm breaking the rules a bit now. When I said office hardware, kind of breaking the rule a little bit here. When I said aircon, I didn't kind of mean your average aircon unit. Oops. This particular aircon unit had a publicly accessible IP address and responded to UPnP requests. On a public IP address, which is very, very silly. It also happens to sit in the ceiling cavity of a carefully sealed research laboratory in a country I'm not allowed to tell you about. When I found this and reported it to them, I got a response back in about 6 minutes. They then went and fixed it after about another 8 minutes, and then sent me an email asking me very nicely not to tell anybody that it had happened and not to tell anybody who it was, because if people started poking around in their network and found something else, it could be quite dangerous, because you're about to find out why. The particular research lab is a BSL-3. I don't know how many people in here know what BSL-3 is, but BSL stands for biosafety level. A BSL-3 actually it turns out it was a virology lab, and a BSL-3 houses generally really nasty pathogens. The only higher level is a BSL-4, and there's only about 4 or 5 of them in the world, I think. There's a few BSL-3s, but I'm not allowed to tell you which one it was. Resident Evil, anybody? No, it wasn't. It was not Umbrella Corporation. I'm not aware of them harvesting any T-virus in any little blue swirly vials. But yeah, it was not good. So BSL-3 labs are negative pressure, so they keep them at a pressure lower than the standard environment, such that any air leaks will actually just suck stuff in rather than pushing stuff out. The only air exchange that can be done is through a special air conditioning and scrubbing units. You see where this is going. And the air conditioning unit has to adhere to certain government specifications, but none of those apply to InfoSec. So yes, you can have a super safe triple backup system and this, that and the other and make sure that everything's properly tested, but then you leave it plugged into a network and anybody can access it. And in this particular case, what actually happened was an outside consultant needed to get access to something, and he wired it up to a public IP address, and Shodan picked it up. And I found it and told them about it. So UPnP, all the things. Somebody decided it was a good idea to put UPnP on that device, and the technical oversight, it was given a public IP address. External IP address was on Shodan. Device assumed that if you have an IP address, you are an authenticated user because you're on the local network. Having an IP is apparently a form of authentication. According to the... and the best part is, if you point it at an external network, like the internet, it assumes that the entire internet is its local networks. Awesome! Then, according to the manual, various performance critical settings can be modified by UPnP. When you read through it, it's pretty scary reading. Potential loss of life because you would be able to leak pathogens out and actually turn off the network interface controller on the device, and it would not be able to send out an alert that it failed. Because it doesn't do sort of like these periodical say, I'm alive, everything's okay. It just goes, and then it goes, oh, something's wrong, I need to tell somebody. But if the neck's down, it can't. So, pretty bad. As I say. Conclusion for the manufacturers. Oh, I think I'm getting close to mid-time now. I may have overrun a little bit. Manufacturers have a responsibility to properly implement security measures, not just add them in as an afterthought. Not everything is UPnP, FTP, SNMP and POP3. Stop sticking extra things in there. Just stop and think before you add another service. Everything adds an extra block to the attack surface. If you build your hardware around a full operating system, for example, an embedded Linux system, design your security architecture in a way that considers the fact that no bug is ever going to patch it because nobody ever does. If you find a photocopier from 1995, well, guess what? The last update will have been in 1994. It's completely mad. Conclusion for your defenders. These devices plug into your network might look benign, but they're horribly vulnerable. They can be really nasty. They can do really horrible things, like I just explained. Photocopier, printer, interactive voice response systems, fire alarms, air conditioning units might all be used as a base operations because it's essentially a computer. If you can get a shell in that and then put Nmap on it, well, and you know, whatever, stick Metasploit on it if you really want. It's essentially an embedded system that you can use as a platform to attack things, and so don't assume that they're all good. Stop treating them as trusted because they are untrusted. Just because they're in your network doesn't mean they're trusted. They should never be trusted. And be prepared to cry in the corner because vendors are never going to fix their gear. It's never going to happen. They have no incentive to, unless the government turns around and says you are now liable for when some hacker comes in and breaks into your bit of your printer or a bit of gear. It's never going to happen. And the conclusion for the attackers: once you've got access to one of these devices, your job's easy because you can break into it with almost no effort. As I said before, remote code execution on almost every single service, stuff as old as the 90s, it's completely insane. Almost every net admin and sysop will treat office equipment as trusted hardware because why not? This stuff wasn't hard to find at all. Just look around on your network or look on Showdown if you want to find other people's stuff. And one cool trick, I've forgotten the guy's name, but he did a talk at 44Con about low-cost attacks, and he was talking about like decapping chips and things like that. And he gave me this great piece of advice, which is FCC IDs, which is for sort of American regulations of like certain emissions and various regulations around consumer hardware. On equipment, they will reveal all sorts of fun information if you type them into the FCC database, because you get all the internal photos of all the individual boards, you get all sorts of information about the emissions testing, various sort of internals that you would never get to find from the manufacturer's website. They will never tell you this stuff, but you can find it quite easily on the FCC website. It's quite nice. In some cases, you actually what you'll get is people will scratch the chip numbers off the chips on the way out of production. You go on the FCC site and they've got the photos pre-production with all the chip numbers on there, which is great. It's really awesome for listening to any of this stuff. Thank you for listening. Any questions?
Just a quick question about the passwords stored on the routers.
Yep.
When you create a new password, would it overwrite the previous one on the router? So it just recreate
any change you make to the settings for the device, it runs a whole new configuration file from scratch, including the old, so your old password gets left on there, and you've got the new password as well.
Is there an unlimited number of configurations?
Roughly 10 times on a 16 megabit, but the WGR 625 has a 32 megabit, so you can roughly assume that it's going to double that, so you might have 20 old configurations on there. If in the last 20 times that you've updated you used a different password for anything, you've just given your password out to somebody if you throw it away.
Write a quick script to change the password to a random value a couple million times, then
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that would do the job. Or even you don't even need to do that. Just set the password to something blank and then just overwrite all the configs. Just change something in the config, because it doesn't need to be that. But then you still run into the problem that certain other config information, for example, the last MAC addresses like the DHCP table, some of them cache the DHCP table into the firmware, into the EEPROM, so that on reboot it's got a nice pre-cached DHCP table, so it doesn't need to change your IP a lot. A lot of people don't like that, even though they are on DHCP. You still get the same IP address, and that's because it was cached in the flash chip. So you often, even if you're not giving out your passwords, you might be giving out network topology data and all sorts of other random configuration stuff.
So presumably these sort of vulnerabilities are going to be available on your Coke machine, your fridge.
Probably.
Connect these to the internet.
Yeah, wouldn't surprise me at all. Quite a cool one. I'm from Nottingham. There's a Nottingham Hackspace. They made their own they took a vending machine and then put a load of stuff like Arduinos and stuff in there, and you can buy them. But they hacked it and replaced the internal module and all the internal electronics for it, so that you could use like NFC to pay for it and things like that. But one of the things that they found was that all of the when they were looking to flash the firmware of the original hardware, eventually they decided it was just couldn't be bothered, let's replace it with something else. But when they went to go flash the original stuff, they found that it was horribly vulnerable to all sorts of crazy stuff, even things like backdoors that were put in via the keypad. You can just put in a certain thing and it like gets you into some debugging mode and all sorts of crazy stuff. But all of the anything like that's got payment processing in it as well. Some of them, like you can find old payment terminals. They've got all of the data still stored on the EEPROM. It's usually unencrypted. So you could have like your merchant IDs and this, that, and the other all stored on your EEPROM. Anybody else? No? Okay, thank you.